Good evening, everyone. Good evening, and welcome. My name is Dr. Danielle Williams, and I'm the Associate Vice Chancellor and Executive Director of the Office of Equal Opportunity and Compliance at the University of Arkansas. And it is an honor and a welcome that you're here this evening, and what I have no doubt will be an outstanding lecture. I'd like to begin the program with Crystal Bridges Indigenous Peoples Acknowledgement. We recognize our role as settlers and guests in the Northwest Arkansas region. We acknowledge the Caddo, Kupa, and Osage, as well as many indigenous caretakers of this land and water. We appreciate the enduring influence of the vibrant, diverse, and contemporary cultures of indigenous peoples. We are conscious of the role in colonization that museums have played. As cultural institutions, we have a responsibility to engage in the dismantling of historical and systemic invisibility of indigenous people, past, present, and future. We choose to intentionally hold ourselves accountable to appropriate conversation, representation, connection, and education to facilitate a space of measurable change. Now, it is an honor to welcome you all in person and virtually for a conversation featuring acclaimed speaker and author Hannibal B. Johnson, commemorating Black Wall Street and the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre. Now, whether you're joining us here in the Great Wall or, I said Great Hall, I wish I was at the Great Wall. Told you I'd tell a joke here and there. The Great Hall, or tuning in virtually. We're thrilled to have this opportunity to bring the talk to an audience over the country, over the course of the opportunity, and it wouldn't be possible without the generous support of Spotlight Series, Del Monte Foods Incorporated. In tonight's talk, we will understand and know the significance of Black Wall Street and the 1921 Tulsa Massacre, as I said. And then personally, Hannibal from Fort Smith, have to throw that out there. I'm very proud to know him and to know his legacy, and to understand the significance of how Black culture is and how he perpetuates that throughout his life. So I would be remiss if I did not personally give him a round of applause for all that he's done historically and for our community. So now I'll do what I've been asked to do. So I'm going to introduce Mr. Hannibal Johnson. Mr. Hannibal Johnson is a Harvard Law School graduate, and he is an author, attorney, and consultant. He has taught at the University of Tulsa College of Law, Oklahoma State University, and the University of Oklahoma. Johnson serves on numerous boards and commissions, including Federal 400 Years of African American History Commission and the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre Centennial Commission. His books, including Black Wall Street 100, An American City Grapples with Its Historical Racial Trauma, chronicles the African American experience in Oklahoma and its indelible impact on African American history. Johnson's play, Big Mama Speaks, a Tulsa Race Riots Survivor Story, was selected for the 2011 National Black Theater Festival and has staged in Caux, Switzerland, He has received copious honors and awards for his work and for his community service. So this discussion this evening will be moderated by Dr. Caree Banton. Dr. Banton is an associate professor of African American history and African diaspora history and the director of African and African American Studies at the University of Arkansas. Banton received a master's in development studies from the University of Ghana and completed her doctoral work at Vanderbilt University. Her research focuses on moments around abolition, emancipation, colonization, as well as ideas of citizenship, Blackness, nationhood in the 19th century. She is a member of the University of Arkansas Teaching Academy and has been named a master teacher in Fulbright College. It is my pleasure to welcome all of you this evening. Please join me in welcoming our moderator for the evening, Dr. Caree Banton, and our speaker, Mr. Hannibal Johnson.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Thank you so much for joining us for this very timely and necessary conversation. And we're so honored to have somebody of your caliber to have this discussion with us today. So as a way of getting into this discussion about Tulsa and the massacre and the events that has emerged to commemorate that 100th anniversary, I'd like us to start a little bit back, right? Because you've been at the center of so many recent developments, as Dr. Williams pointed out, namely the commission the Federal Commission to explore the 400-year history to commemorate the 20 and odd Negroes who landed in Jamestown in 1619. So I think that dovetails nicely into understanding what would lead up to Tulsa. Can you tell us a little bit about your work with that?
Yeah, so I have the privilege of serving on the 400 Years of African American History Commission. It's a federal commission. We were funded about a year ago. We got, I think, $3 million or so, which is more than the zero budget we had when we initially started. And so our role primarily is just to acknowledge what is. Part of the problem around African American history generally is that it's marginalized. It's often not included in regular curricula, so people are just ignorant. When I say ignorant, I mean ignorant in a dictionary sense. They just don't know.
Right.
And I tell people that it's impossible to know American history without knowing Black history. It's just not possible. So one of the things we've strived to do is to elevate some of the icons from Black history, to celebrate some of the milestones of the Black experience in America, and to encourage inclusivity, encourage what Professor Howard Zinn would call a people's history of the United States,
right,
so that everybody is incorporated and included equally.
Yes, and that 2019 marked that 400-year anniversary and has highlighted so much of what has been hidden or left out and excluded intentionally from American history. But that sets a very, interesting context for what would then bring African Americans to the Oklahoma Territory. Can you talk a little bit about that? How do African Americans end up in Oklahoma and in the space that the massacre would eventually happen?
So that's one of the many stories that we just don't know. When we don't know them because they're not taught as part of the regular curriculum, they're not included in textbooks. How many of you have heard of the 5 civilized tribes? The Cherokees, the Muskogee Creeks, the Choctaws, the Chickasaws, and the Seminoles. All 5 of those tribes had their original homelands in the southeastern United States, and they were forcibly removed from their homelands by the federal government in the 1830s and 1840s. At the time, all 5 of those tribes were practicing chattel slavery. So there were members of the tribes who had enslaved Africans, property that they owned. So when they were forced out of the Southeast in the 1830s and 1840s, along with them were people of African descent. And that's one of the initial migrations of black folks to Oklahoma as mostly enslaved persons living among the 5 civilized tribes.
Right.
Then in the late 1800s, there were land openings and land lotteries in what is now Oklahoma. So when Oklahoma Territory opened up in 1889, a number of the people who migrated into the territory were black, including a fellow named E.P. McCabe. McCabe had been the state auditor in the state of Kansas, the highest elected black official in the country at the time. He came to Oklahoma 1889, April, in the land run, founded the all-black town of Langston, where Langston University is. Oklahoma, interestingly, has more all-black towns historically than any other state in the Union.
Over 50.
Over 50. And part of McCabe's dream was to carve out within what is now Oklahoma an all-black state. It might seem fanciful by today's standards, but he was taken very seriously. He met with United States President Benjamin Harrison in 1890. They talked about carving out an all-black state. It obviously did not happen,
Right.
but instead, there were many all-black towns in Oklahoma. So the migration to Oklahoma was for a number of reasons, not the least of which was it was perceived as a place to escape the oppression that black people faced in the Deep South, in Mississippi, in Alabama, and in Georgia. And it was also perceived as a place where economic opportunity was widespread because of the availability of land. Land was essentially an accession to wealth at the time. So for these reasons, black folks migrated to Oklahoma in great numbers. They were, I think, stunned when Oklahoma became a state in 1907. The first thing that Oklahoma did as a state was pass segregation laws in 1907.
Right.
So we have the irony of these people migrating from places that are oppressive,
Right.
going to a place that becomes oppressive after they arrive.
Right. Wonderful. We see segregation happening, and that forms a part of the context. But there are also other economic and political activities happening, not just in the wider United States, but in Oklahoma and Tulsa more directly, that would shape what would eventually happen in Greenwood. Can you tell us a little bit about that national, state, and local context in that early 19th century?
Yeah, so in Oklahoma around the turn of the century, of course, in the Tulsa area particularly, oil was discovered.
Right.
So oil became really the driving force behind what Tulsa became. Tulsa would ultimately become the so-called oil capital of the world. So the leadership of Tulsa, the white leadership of Tulsa, really wanted to position Tulsa nationwide as a cosmopolitan city, a destination point for people from all throughout the United States. So that's what was happening when Greenwood, the black community in Tulsa, was forming as well. That community benefited from the relative wealth of the oil industry because people who provided services, people who were, for example, domestics or did shoe shine work or any kind of day labor type work, they benefited by having a wealthy white community there as well. But Tulsa also was seen as a place of economic opportunity.
Right.
Generally. So a lot of black professionals, doctors, lawyers, accountants, dentists, people like that, and a lot of entrepreneurs, people who had just regular mom and pop type businesses, restaurants, grocery stores, haberdasheries, movie theaters, dance halls, hotels, rooming houses, garages, confectionaries. So Tulsa, the Greenwood community, the black community that abuts downtown, became sort of a black haven or a black mecca. These people were essentially shut out of the mainstream economy. I use the term economic detour.
Right.
It's as though they approached the gates of economic opportunity in downtown Tulsa, they were turned away.
Right.
And so what they did was they diverted back into the Greenwood community, their home community, and created these businesses that were successful because dollars circulated and recirculated within the confines of that community.
Right.
And even those people who worked outside the community, they may have worked outside, but they brought the dollars back.
Right.
So if you were a domestic working in a white household, you brought your money back and you got your hair done.
Right.
You had a meal. You went to the movies, right? You went to a dance hall on a Friday night. So that really boosted the economic fortunes of the community for years.
Okay. And what was the relationship between Main Street, Tulsa, and what was then emerging, as Booker T. Washington called it, Negro Wall Street. What was the feeling between those two communities?
Yeah, I think it's important to think about what the national context was, because what happened in Tulsa in terms of the massacre in 1921 is emblematic of what was happening in the United States more generally. So we know that at the early part of the 20th century, historians and sociologists would call this period the nadir of race relations in America. Nadir is just a word that means a low point.
Right.
And what they were referring to is the fact that there were these events all over the country that were being called race riots. I'm
Right.
choosing my words very carefully. They're being called race riots. They were mainly assaults on black communities, but they were called race riots.
Right.
So in 1919, there were more than 24 so-called race riots in America. New York, Baltimore, Washington, D.C., Chicago, Omaha, Elaine, Arkansas,
Yeah.
Longview, Texas, and on and on and on.
St. Louis.
James Weldon Johnson with an NAACP called the summer and fall of 1919 Red Summer.
Red Summer.
Red is a metaphorical reference to blood, mostly black blood, flowing in the streets from this domestic violence.
Right.
The other thing that's going on during this same period is lynching. And, normally when I talk about lynching, people automatically think of someone being hanged. And that's sort of a part of it, but what lynching really is domestic terrorism.
Right.
It's domestic terrorism aimed primarily at black people. The point of the lynching is not simply to brutalize or dehumanize a single black person or even a group of black people. It's to send a message to all black people about their relative place in society.
Right.
It's to reinforce white supremacy.
Right.
So that's the context in which Tulsa occurs. So rather than being an anomaly, something that stands apart, Tulsa really is reflective of the racial history and experience of the period.
Wonderful. So you wrote Black Wall Street 100, An American City Grapples with Its Racial Trauma. For those of us who aren't familiar, probably those of us who have watched Watchmen that kind of pushed the Tulsa race massacre into the national imaginary, could you tell us what happened to lead up to this massacre and the trauma that you were referring to?
Absolutely. So most people are just vaguely aware of what I call the trigger incident. It's an incident that involved two teenagers in an elevator. But let's take a step back and look at the root causes of what happened in Tulsa. So we talked about the national context, the horrible racial violence, including so-called race riots and lynchings. Another factor that plays into what happened in Tulsa was what I call land lust, which is to say that the community, the black community, was situated on a parcel of land that some wealthy business folk wanted. They wanted to use it for what they considered to be higher and better uses, including the location of a railroad depot. So there was talk before the massacre of moving the black community farther north and taking the land and using it for other purposes. So we have to keep that in mind.
Yes.
Psychologically, I think the simple term would be jealousy, but the more complex and I think the more helpful term is cognitive dissonance. And what I mean by that, it goes to the question you asked earlier. You have in this community a dominant white population living physically across the Frisco tracks from the black community. Some people in the white community were not doing well economically, yet they could stand on the Frisco tracks, look over to the north into the black community and see black people owning homes, driving cars, wearing furs, shopping in their own stores.
Airplanes.
Flying airplanes. Therein lies the cognitive dissonance, which is just a sort of complex way of saying, I'm a white person, I subscribe to white supremacy, which at that time certainly most white people did.
Right.
So I believe that I'm better and more entitled than these people across the tracks.
Right.
But I'm actually positioned here, and some of those people are positioned here. How do I harmonize those things? Well, one way we might harmonize that is to bring these people down a peg or two.
Right.
And violence is a way to do that. Destroy what they have is a way to do that. So in addition to that, the Klan, the KKK, the iconic domestic terrorist organization, had a huge presence in Tulsa and in Oklahoma throughout the 1920s. So Tulsa has the dubious distinction of having one of the first female auxiliaries of the Klan and one of the first youth chapters of the Klan. And finally, we talk about the role of the media in society today, as well we should,
Right.
but the media were significant then as well. So there was an afternoon daily newspaper called the Tulsa Tribune that published a series of incendiary, inflammatory articles and editorials during this period
Right.
that really fomented hostility in sectors of the white community against the black community.
Right.
So what we have is sort of a racial crucible. We have a tinderbox or a powder keg, and what we need is simply an igniter, a match to throw on the smoldering embers. And we get that
Right.
with these two teenagers.
Right.
Dick Rowland, black boy, 19, shine shoes downtown. He dropped out of Booker T. Washington High School. Sarah Page, a white girl who operates an elevator in a popular building downtown called the Drexel Building. It's Monday, May 30th, 1921. Dick Rowland needs to use the restroom. Facilities are segregated. He goes to where he knows the restroom is located, on the third floor of the Drexel Building. He boards the elevator. Sarah is manually operating the elevator. Something happens, we don't know what, and we'll probably never will know exactly what. But whatever happened caused him to bump into or brush up against Sarah Page, and she overreacted. She began screaming. The elevator landed back in the lobby. Of course he was frightened, she's screaming. He's black and she's white.
Right.
She exits the elevator, she's distraught. She's comforted by a clerk from Renberg's locally owned store.
Right.
She tells him that she's been assaulted on the elevator. He's concerned, he calls the police. The police arrest Dick Rowland. She later recants or retracts the original story. The problem is that daily afternoon newspaper, the Tulsa Tribune, published an account of the event in the next day's newspaper. This will be May 31st, 1921. The Tribune publishes an article entitled "Nab Negro for Attacking Girl in an Elevator." So the Tribune essentially says in this article, this black boy tried to rape this respectable white girl in a public building in downtown Tulsa in broad daylight.
Which was very formulaic in terms
It's very,
of.
very formulaic, really salacious and untrue, a false narrative, really. And the Tribune also includes in that article information designed to make Sarah Page, the girl, look more virtuous. And of course, that makes Dick Rowland look more villainous. So, not surprisingly, a white mob ultimately gathers. The white mob numbers in the thousands ultimately. There's talk of lynching Dick Rowland, taking him from the jail and hanging him. Black men are concerned. The sheriff even reaches out to them, says, look, I'm hearing this stuff. I'm concerned. But I protected Dick Rowland. He's in the jail. Jail sits atop the courthouse. I've shut off the elevators. I've got my guards protecting the stairs. He'll be fine. The black men are concerned because they know about lynching generally, because they know that there was a lynching just 9 months earlier in the Tulsa area of a teenage white boy who had been accused of murdering a taxi cab driver. So lynching is a real possibility. A group of black men, several dozen in number, marched down to the courthouse. Some of them are
These
armed.
were former soldiers.
Some of them are former soldiers, World War I. They know how to use those weapons. As you might imagine, words are exchanged between the larger white group, which again ultimately numbers in the thousands, smaller black group, several dozen men. A white man tries to take a black man's gun. The gun discharges, and in the words of one of the survivors of the massacre, all hell broke loose after that. And that's where the destruction began. The violence of the massacre really lasted only about 16 hours, but it was devastating. It really obliterated the Greenwood community. We believe somewhere between 100 and 300 people were killed. We know at least 1,250 homes were destroyed, in addition to churches, schools, libraries, businesses, etc. We know that conservatively estimated at the time, damages were $1.5 to $2 million. That's in the tens of millions of dollars, if not the hundreds of millions, depending on how I calculate it today.
Right.
We know that people in the black community were literally interned during this chaos. They were forcibly taken to these detention centers throughout the city. And according to a number of the survivors, what that did was, these were mostly men, it left the community defenseless, so that the mob members were able to come in and to loot and to destroy property, etc.
Right.
The Red Cross provided the post-massacre relief, food, shelter, clothing, health care, et cetera.
Well, and there are accounts of Tulsa State Police being involved, planes flying overhead, dropping kerosene or turpentine on the community.
Here's what we know. We know that local law enforcement deputized people in the mob, the people who destroyed property and killed people. We know that. We know that members of the mob prevented the Tulsa Fire Department from putting out the fires as they raged. We know that planes flew overhead. The official version of events is that the planes were reconnaissance planes. They were looking to survey what was going on the ground. But many eyewitnesses, including really credible eyewitnesses like B.C. Franklin, the father of Dr. John Hope Franklin, said that the planes were dropping incendiary devices, kerosene, nitroglycerin, maybe dynamite. Whatever these devices were, they caused the flames to burn more brilliantly and spread more rapidly.
Right. Wow. Now, that created the historical trauma that
Absolutely.
you are talking about in Black Wall Street 100. Can you describe this trauma for us? How did it leave the community in the immediate aftermath and in the longue durée?
So the community was, of course, shell-shocked, but we talked about this a little earlier. The overarching narrative here is the indomitable human spirit. So what's really important to take from all this is the incredible black folks who actually had the vision to create this community, who nurtured the community, who resurrected the community even after the massacre and even in the face of really incredible roadblocks.
Right.
And so the trauma is, I think, manifest in a number of ways.
Right.
Immediately after the event, it's manifest in not talking about the event. So people often ask, why are we just discovering this history? Well, the history was underground for many, many years, decades, in part because even the victims didn't want to talk about it. Post-traumatic stress disorder is a thing.
Right.
It may not have been a thing by name at the time, but these people suffered from that. So some of the survivors would say things like, we didn't talk about this in my family because the elders were afraid that they would burden us with this and it would hamper our ability to grow and to develop into fully actualized human beings. So
Right.
they didn't want to talk about it.
Right.
And they were some of them were fearful. This could actually happen again. We know that the Rosewood Massacre in Florida happened in 1923, which is 2 years after Tulsa. I think the trauma manifests today in a number of ways. The most noticeable is what I call a gulf of distrust. So there's profound distrust in the black community with respect to, I would say, white institutional authority. And you can trace that directly back, I think, to things like when your police department deputizes people who destroy your community, even though it was 100 years ago, you might distrust your police department.
Right.
So it creates a lot of profound wounds that linger. And they linger, ironically, in part because we've taken such great pains to not acknowledge them.
Right. I was very fascinated as I was looking at the accounts of, as you were referring to earlier, this resilience among black people, this indomitable spirit that has carried us through. But the documents that showed that, right? You have a letter from Oliver to Curtis, and Curtis writing back that really highlights that. I'm like, I was like ugly crying as I was reading that. Can you tell us about some of the documents that you discovered as you were curating for the museum and researching your book?
Yeah, perhaps the best example is what you're talking about. It's letters that are exchanged between two friends. A gentleman named Oliver, who was writing. Oliver's in Detroit, and he's writing to his friend who he knows is in Tulsa and has just lived through the massacre in 1921. And Oliver, I wish I had the letters to actually read. I don't have them with me. But Oliver says, "Look, buddy, I understand that you've been through a horrible, traumatic event. I really feel for you. I have great empathy for you. Enclosed in this envelope is a check for $40. And I want you to go and get a ticket and take a train, come up to Detroit, and start a new life here in Detroit. And so the fellow who receives it, Curtis, who's living in Tulsa, essentially says, "You're so thoughtful and you're so kind." But that's just not me. I mean, I came here and built my fortune with this spirit. I'm gonna stick it out. I'm gonna live here with that spirit. I'm not gonna be forced out of my home because of this or any other event. Essentially, he's saying, as a representative of the community, he's saying, we shall not be moved, right? Mm-hmm. We're not going anywhere. You can do this, you can take a few of us if you want, but no, we're not giving up this community. This is ours as much as it's yours. And so it's a really powerful expression of the human spirit, particularly the black spirit at
Yes.
the time. Mm-hmm. And when I think about it, I think, well, where would he go? Because Detroit, there were lots of problems in Detroit at the time and throughout history as well. Mm-hmm. And in Chicago, and in all these places around the United States. So in many ways, and this is really a dramatic way to say it, but it was open season on black folks during this period. I can't personally imagine living during that period.
Yes, absolutely. And we see that in archival documents like the letter you just referenced, but we know that there was a study that was undertaken some 20 odd years ago that interviewed many of the survivors of the massacre. What did you take away from what they said about their experience?
Back then, this is 20 years ago, and I actually knew a number of the survivors. What sticks out to me is what most of them wanted more than anything else might be surprising. What they wanted was that their story be told, that people just know what happened to them, and that they thought that in knowing, it would be preventative. It would prevent that from happening again, if people just knew the depths to which we could sink as human beings.
Wow. Now, were there compensation for this enormous loss of property of lives in Tulsa?
No, there has not been any compensation. There were promises made by the chamber and the city early on, but it sort of didn't pan out. There was a lawsuit filed on behalf of the survivors back in 2003. At the time, there were more than 100 survivors living. The lawsuit was filed in federal court, and it was essentially dismissed based on statute of limitations, which is to say, this kind of lawsuit, if you're going to bring it, you should have brought it many, many years ago.
Right.
The problem, of course, is systemic and institutional, because let's assume that they had brought the lawsuit in 1922 or 23. Mm-hmm. It would not have been successful.
Why is that?
Because they were not full-fledged participants in our American democracy in 1922 or 23. Right. And so they would have had no chance with such a lawsuit seeking compensation for this racial violence.
Right.
And if you think about it, again, racial violence was not unusual. It's happening all over the United States. Do you really think the court systems are going to open up and compensate black folks for those losses that often happened with the knowledge of people who were, in fact, elected officials? Right. Some of them lawyers and judges, no doubt.
Were there some kind of legalese that were, that was used at the time? We were talking about nomenclature and the importance of nomenclature to block this pursuit of compensation for the black community?
Yeah, the original event was called the 1921 Tulsa Race Riot. So when you do research on the event, that's likely what you're going to, if you look at old documents, that's what you're going to find. So when we think about nomenclature or what we call things, I favor what we might call a 5-factor analysis. Okay. So let me just back up a step and say that now most people call the event in Tulsa a massacre. I'm happy to call it a massacre, but I think it's actually more complex than that. So I think we need to think about what we're calling things and why. So originally the event was called the 1921 Tulsa Race Riot. So let's ask ourselves, who was at the table when that name was designated? Who was absent from the table when that name was handed down? What's the significance of the word riot? And it just so happens that the word riot is really significant because most insurance policies have and had something called, in law it's called a force majeure clause, an exclusionary clause. So many of the insurance policies back in 1921 had a clause that said, if your damages are occasioned by riot or civil unrest, the insurance company is not going to have to pay. So guess what? The black people who had insurance policies, they had thought this through, they didn't get compensated for their losses because it was designated a riot.
It's a riot.
So that's why the name was chosen is important to think about. It's also important to think about what alternatives to the name might we consider. So when we talk about something that was designated a riot, there are a number of alternatives that we might consider. Massacre is one. That's the one that people have generally settled on. But there are a lot of other terms that apply as well. So I've heard white riot, which focuses on the perpetration of the event as a riot, sort of lawlessness. Pogrom, which is a European term,
right.
Removing people from their property, is a term that a lot of people think is appropriate in this context. Genocide, ethnic cleansing, Holocaust. Holocaust really, at its core, is about damage occasioned by fire, by burning, which is exactly what happened in the Greenwood community.
Right.
So all these are terms that we could use. Not any particular term is perfect. But ultimately we have to settle kind of on using a common language, right?
Right.
So massacre is kind of where we've landed. And then finally, after you analyze those four elements, then think about if the event that happened in Tulsa happened today, and you were the sole authority in terms of naming it, what would you call it? And so for me, when we talk about nomenclature, what's more important than where we ultimately land is the critical thinking process, thinking about why we get to where we get.
Right. And so as a way of kind of, heading into the question and answer section of this talk, what's the difference between Tulsa 1921 and Tulsa 2021? And if you could speak briefly about what do you think any kind of healing, what would that entail?
I think the difference is we've had time and energy around addressing what has been a festering wound. So I advocate for a three-part process that leads us farther along the road to racial reconciliation. For me, racial reconciliation is something that is aspirational. It's not a point that we'll ever achieve. We're on the road to racial reconciliation. So we have done a decent job of late in acknowledging our history, where 20 years ago there were people who would say things like, oh, that was so long ago, we weren't here, let sleeping dogs lie, why are we talking about this? I hardly ever hear that anymore. People really want to know more about the history, want to acknowledge it. We've built a world-class history center. We have done a lot of things in education, including changing the curriculum. We're working on we have state-mandated tests. So we're working with the governor and Department of Education to make sure that some of this history is included on state-mandated tests to give teachers yet another incentive to teach the history.
Right.
So we've done a lot of things in that regard. So acknowledgement, apology, and atonement are the three things that I advocate. So acknowledgement, we've done a number of things. Apology, we've had a number of apologies from our first female mayor, Susan Savage. Our current mayor recently issued another apology. Our city council issued an apology. Those are important, but more important than
The police department
the
as
police
well.
department, Chief Jordan issued a really important apology 7 or 8 years ago. And so those are important to the extent that they create within the community what I would call a reservoir of compassion and empathy, which is what we need.
Right.
Where we haven't done all the work that we need to do, or where the most work remains, is in atonement. So atonement is, how do we repair the damage from this historical racial trauma?
Right.
How do we right the ship? We can never make things perfect, but what is it that we must do to make the community as close to whole as possible? So that it certainly involves investments in education and economic investments in the Black community. Cash reparations for survivors and descendants is something that's being pushed. There's another lawsuit now. It involves all that. The work is ongoing.
Right.
I can't stress enough that if we want to advance the Tulsa community, the Northwest Arkansas community, any community along the road to racial reconciliation, it's continuous work. It doesn't end.
Right.
It's ongoing work. It's education. It's investments of time and energy and money.
Right.
It's closing disparities that we know exist based on race and ethnicity in all our communities across the United States.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so very much. I think we can move into the Q&A period now. Can I get someone for the...
We'll be passing a mic, so if you have a question, just raise your hand and we'll bring it to you.
Yes. So if you have any questions for...
I think she has one over there.
Okay. Is it over here? Okay.
Harold Johnson, thank you very much for being here. It's very much appreciated to hear all the information that you're sharing with us. It's hard to sit here and listen to that without getting emotional, and I know with all the work that you put in. I wanted to know, going forward, I mean, she mentioned something about reparations and about how we're going to fix things. There is nothing that's in place to get any type of compensation? Aren't there documents that show who owned the property and things like that to get it restored? It seems like...
There's a lawsuit pending right now using a different legal theory. We'll see where it goes, but my guess is that if cash reparations are in the offing in the future, they're not going to come through the litigation process. They're going to come through the legislative process, because we have examples historically. The Rosewood Massacre that I mentioned earlier that happened in 1923, the victims of the Rosewood Massacre received reparations from the Florida legislature. People of Japanese ancestry who were interned during World War II received reparations from the United States Congress. So it seems to me that the legislative route is much more conducive to getting what people want in the way of cash reparations. And then we have to talk about, the fact that the devil's in the details. Who gets what and why and what's the proof and all that. But that's not something that's impossible to work out. That can be worked out.
Okay. I also wanted to ask too, you had mentioned legislation, but education is key too. I mean, I'm a product of the educational system here in Arkansas. I was a grown woman before I ever even heard any of this stuff about Elaine, Arkansas and all that. So, I mean, nothing. So I think that if we do get it in the schools, I think that would be something that could begin to start the healing process.
Yeah. So we definitely do not do a good job, not just in Arkansas or in Oklahoma, but in the nation, of teaching about hard history. There are a lot of people who don't want us to think about this history and don't want to be responsible for the past and don't want us to be aware and vocal about pressing for what we deserve as a result of these traumas.
I came from Tulsa originally and graduated in 1969 from Edison High School, which tells you a lot right there, even if the rest of the audience may not know. But and I never heard a word about anything during that whole time. And so I'm wondering, could you address what the since I've been away from there for 50 years, but tell me about how the educational system in Tulsa's been addressing this lately.
Yeah, absolutely. So Tulsa Public Schools has been a great partner in terms of changing the curriculum. Tulsa Public Schools just revamped the curriculum for grades K through 12, such that this history will be incorporated at an age-appropriate level in all grades in multiple disciplines. So, and I think their approach is the right approach. It's an integrative approach. So the history is not just being taught in a history class, it's being taught in English, in math, in economics, and sociology, in a variety of disciplines at age-appropriate levels. And so that ultimately is an approach that I think will be modeled by communities across the nation. Because again, many communities across the nation have experienced historical racial trauma. It's not just Tulsa. Tulsa is unique in terms of the magnitude because it had a highly developed black business community.
Right.
But in terms of the character of the event, it's not unique.
So we have a question that has come in online that is asking you, what has Tulsa done in the last 100 years to recognize and heal from this trauma?
Yeah, I think some of the things that we've talked about, revising the curriculum, building places like Greenwood Rising, which is a museum that tells the full story of the Greenwood district. It's not focused on the massacre. The massacre is an event in the context of a community.
Right.
So the museum focuses on the community and how the community addressed the things that were in its path over time. So the black community as a business community actually came back bigger and better than ever after the massacre, peaking in the early to mid 1940s, and then declining because of integration, because of urban renewal and other factors later on in the 60s and 70s and 80s.
Can you speak to what the business among black folks, what's that like compared to the 1940s, 1920s?
Yeah, so again, part of the irony here is that the black community as a business community was successful because it was segregated. And so many of those people in that community were politically lobbying for integration. The unintended consequence of integration when you have a successful black segregated business community is that you undermine the financial foundation of the black community
Right.
in terms of economics. So it is ironic that integration really was a destructive factor in terms of the black business community. So while you still have some black businesses in the Greenwood community today, it's an integrated community. My office is in the Greenwood community. It's on the corner of Greenwood and Archer, right across from the museum.
Right.
But the community now consists of some businesses, residential presence, 2 college campuses, Oklahoma State University and Langston University, the Greenwood Cultural Center, cultural institutions, a couple of historic churches, Vernon AME and Mount Zion Baptist Church. So it's really kind of an amalgam, a hodgepodge of different interests in an integrated environment. So what I tell people is, given what's happened, what I would like for you to do is embrace the Black Wall Street mindset. And what I mean by that is leverage the fact that we have these historical role models who did incredible things against great odds and hostility. They were successful in an economic sense. So knowing that, we don't have to be successful only in the stereotypical arenas that we see,
Right.
sports and entertainment. We can be successful in business and in entrepreneurship. And we got these historical role models. The Black Wall Street mindset is the mentality, the success mentality that we can embrace. And we're not limited geographically to any physical space. We've got technology.
Yeah.
So we have the whole world at our disposal
Right.
if we understand that we have the capacity to do these things in an economic sense.
Wonderful. Given that you mentioned that it does not necessarily have to be limited by geography or anything like that, I was wondering if, all these, I know the rapper Killer Mike and all these other folks are doing the Greenwood Bank, and all of these, Black Wall Street is now this
Yeah.
term that is circulating to kind of captivate Black business minds in that kind of a way. And I was wondering how the Tulsans are feeling about that kind of co-opting of,
Yeah, I think it is a mixed bag. I think co-opting is an interesting, but if it's used in a positive way, it's fine with me. We don't have any kind of intellectual property rights in that language, so people can use it as they will, as long as they're used in a positive way. I think, particularly to promote business and entrepreneurship, I'm all for it.
Okay. Are there any final questions?
I think a lot of people have looked at Germany, modern Germany, and dealing with their recent Nazi past as sort of a model for dealing with the past. And I lived there for a couple of years and had observed this because the Holocaust is very much taught and discussed and a part of the German educational and cultural system. But if you go to Austria, you immediately get a different feeling, like this is a country that hasn't dealt with that past and hasn't taken the responsibility. So I sit here and think, what is it that makes, or how can we encourage, or why did one group of people take responsibility and work through it and try to deal with it and create justice where another culture didn't? So what can we do, or why are some people, amenable to this kind of a process and others reject it?
Yeah, that's the $64,000 question.
Say it.
Yeah, I think we just have to persevere. Ultimately, I'm glad you brought up the Holocaust. I think that's a great analog. I think, ultimately, it boils down to something as simple as our shared humanity. If we all embraced our shared humanity, if we all appreciated the dignity and worth of every other human being, there wouldn't be a Holocaust. There wouldn't have been a 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre. There wouldn't have been Lane, Arkansas. There wouldn't have been an insurrection on January the 6th. I mean, it's all connected. And so we're always going to have resistance to the notion that people are all equal. Because I think we need to be more open and honest about what we have in this country. We have a strong strain of this notion of white supremacy, that white people are inherently better than other people. And we got to call it what it is.
Absolutely, and who the victims are matters too.
Yeah, it does.
Yep.
Well, I appreciate you, Hannibal, and Dr. Banton for this presentation. I think it's an excellent discussion and an excellent time to discuss these things. I appreciate that last question, too, because when you think about it, we have factors in our society, many of them are politicians, state, local, and even on a national level, that are pushing back against learning this history. And the more we allow them to push back against that knowledge, the more we allow those kinds of things to risk occurring again, but also the effects of it to continue to affect current and future generations. And I just wondered if either of you would like to speak to that too.
Yeah, we had a law passed in Oklahoma recently, House Bill 1775, which is exactly what you say. So there's this movement, and it's really a nationalized movement that's being pushed to certain state legislatures to create this boogeyman out of what's called critical race theory. I've done diversity, equity, inclusion work for more than 20 years. I've never used the term critical race theory in anything I've ever done. It's an academic framework. So, but it sounds really scary if you don't know what it is. So people are afraid, and this legislation is based in, I say it's based in fear and fragility, right? And so people are talking about things they don't even know about, and scaring people into thinking that, essentially we are trying to take over in some way. I don't know how that's possible. I understand that demographics are changing rapidly, but the reality is, while demographics are changing and we're ultimately going to become a majority country, the positions at the top are not changing. They're not changing very fast at all. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely.
They're not changing. So the power is not really changing nearly as fast as the worker bees, the demographic worker bees at the bottom level.
Yeah, and I think, both questions are related, in terms of, you think of living in a white supremacist society where this country foundationally establishes itself that one race must be at the bottom, and how it preserves that idea even through transformation, right? Whereas, the victims of the Holocaust, they get a state. The victims of the racial massacres in the United States are still here, and they're still demanding for rights and asking for the United States to live up to its creed. And, in a white supremacist society, when you don't control the levers of power, you take 5 steps forward and 10 steps backwards. And that's what we're seeing now with critical race theory, where legislature and our dear senator here has, moved to the 1619 Project Critical Race Theory. We have a Juneteenth holiday, but even as there moves to ban why we even have Juneteenth, right? So we have to recognize this contradiction and understand that we as individuals, I think that's a part of what you've spoken to, that individuals have a role to play in healing this kind of racial trauma, wherever we are, whether I am at the university, you're in your law firm, and wherever we are in our community, we do have a role to play. If it's just having a conversation, having this very uncomfortable conversation, that we do have a role to play.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important point, because it's sometimes really easy to be frustrated if you're doing this kind of work, and it is 1 step forward, 2 steps back sometimes. Dr. King said, we must accept finite disappointments, but we must never lose infinite hope, which is really important. So it's important that we understand our own agency, which is our capacity to make change, even incremental change. Right. We've got to understand that. So we elect people for school boards, and we elect people who serve in the state legislature, and we elect people who serve in Congress and in the Senate, and we elect a president. But many of us don't take that really seriously. We don't exercise the franchise like we should. So if we don't do that, then we really can't complain with credibility about the results that we get. We have to become more active about the things that matter to us. If this matters to you, then you gotta let people know it matters, particularly people who are elected by you and who supposedly represent you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, and thank you all for coming.